Our daily cancellation today has evolved quite a bit. Or maybe it's more true to say that it has metamorphosed into a beautiful, ill-tempered butterfly. However you want to put it, I had planned today to cancel the CIA for its now infamous woke recruitment ad featuring a female CIA agent who says that she is, quote, a cisgender millennial, a woman of color, and intersectional. She also says that her existence is not a box-checking exercise, even as she proceeds to check every box she can. Now, all of this is extremely stupid, worse than stupid when you consider that the CIA is recruiting people who'd be better suited teaching gender theory at Portland Community College, where all the students should attend for free, says Jill Biden. But the worst part of the ad is when she boasts about her generalized anxiety disorder. This is someone working for the CIA who's bragging about the fact that they have anxiety disorder. And she includes it as one of the identity boxes to check. So on her victimhood resume, anxiety disorder is listed right alongside woman of color and intersectional and all the rest of it. This is what we've done in our society. We have turned things like anxiety into mental disorders and then made mental disorders trendy. Something that people like this woman quite literally advertise. And that's what sent me off in a different direction. As I thought about it, I became less interested in the CIA ad and more interested in this issue of anxiety and what we in modern culture have made of it. And that's what prompted me to tweet the following thought last night. I said, quoting myself, "One of the worst things to happen in modern times is the medicalization of the human condition. Now people who experience anxiety think they're sick. They aren't. Anxiety is a fundamental fact of human existence. It is not a disease." That's what I wrote. That's what I believe. We have set out to medicalize and diseaseify every aspect of the human condition, every difficult emotion, every unpleasant personality trait. That's why the DSM now has something like 300 mental disorders listed, and over 50 million adults in this country have been diagnosed with at least one of them. Now, as you might expect, that opinion provoked an intense and almost entirely negative reaction. Almost entirely negative public reaction, I should qualify. I have gotten a lot of private messages from people whispering their agreement with me, saying, "Hey, I agree with you, attaboy, thumbs up." But in public, almost everyone who's chimed in and contributed to the discussion has been of the opinion that I am wrong, and not only wrong, but a filthy, worthless piece of human dirt for even daring to say something like this out loud. Or tweet it out loud. Now I am saying it out loud because the one way to ensure that I keep saying something and keep saying it louder and louder is to demand that I stop saying it. Yes, that's the maturity level for me. You tell me to stop saying it, I'm going to say it louder. That's the way I work. Now, I'd like to explain my point of view a little bit, but I want to be clear before I do that this explanation is in no way an apology. I don't apologize at all. I'm really happy that I said what I said, and I couldn't have been more right about it. And if you're someone who reacts to an honest opinion by screaming and crying and ranting and raving, the problem is you. You, in fact, owe me an apology for being so unreasonable and annoying. So I accept your apology. You are forgiven. Now let's move on to the actual issue. And as far as that goes, a few points I want to make. Number one, I have been accused of stigmatizing mental illness with this opinion. I'm told the same whenever I argue that ADHD is not a real mental illness, which it isn't. Not a real disorder, which it isn't. But what I'm doing is exactly the opposite of stigmatizing. What I'm saying is that anxiety is an inevitable part of being human. It comes with our consciousness and self-awareness. Stigmatize? No, to stigmatize is to say that it's weird or embarrassing. If anything, calling it a mental disorder is stigmatizing. I'm also not minimizing anxiety. I'm not stigmatizing or minimizing. Just because it comes with being human doesn't mean that it's any less painful, difficult, sometimes overwhelming. Neither am I saying that those struggling with their anxiety shouldn't seek help. Again, just because anxiety is human doesn't mean that we should wallow helplessly in it. So I'm not stigmatizing, I'm not minimizing, and I'm not saying that people shouldn't get help. I'm simply arguing that we have made a category error. We have placed anxiety along with many other human emotions and experiences, like, for example, despair, into a medical box when it doesn't belong there. 2, the idea that anxiety is a fundamental fact of human existence, a defining fact, actually, is not new or bold. I wish I could take credit for having this bold, interesting, new opinion. I don't. Only the last 18 seconds or so did we decide as a country, as a society, to start treating these things as psychiatric disorders. Prior to the medicalization push, anxiety was a subject for philosophers and theologians and other great minds. This is not an argument from authority. My critics are the ones making arguments from authority. I'll get to that in a minute. But my point is simply that what I'm saying about anxiety has been said, or something very close to it has been said, by many people much smarter than myself and much smarter than you probably, all throughout history. That doesn't mean that I'm right, but it does mean that if you're shocked by the idea that I present here, if you react to it like it's absurd or outlandish, then I have to suspect that you really haven't thought much about it or read anything about it. If you'd spend any significant time reflecting on anxiety and reading what others have said about it throughout history, then you certainly would have encountered my point of view many times and should not therefore be recoiling in shock and horror. If you are recoiling in shock and horror, then consider the possibility that you haven't given this topic much thought. Number 3, I have been told that I am not qualified to give my opinion on this subject because I'm not a doctor. But I note with interest that almost all of the people telling me that I'm not qualified because I lack a medical degree also themselves lack a medical degree. Turns out that you don't need a doctor. You don't need to be a doctor to have an opinion. You need to be a doctor to have an opinion that differs from their own. That is an argument from authority, and it's also ad hoc, childish, and stupid. Besides, my point here, once again, is that this is not a medical issue. To demand my medical credentials is to beg the question. You're expecting me to abide by your premise, but I'm rejecting your premise. That's the whole point of the argument. Doctors may be experts on medical conditions, but they're not experts on the human condition. I'm not sure that anyone can be an expert on that per se because they can only experience their own humanity and not anybody else's. But I do think that some people are blessed with wisdom that gives them greater insight into the subject than others. I don't think that doctors often have that insight, actually. I think it's a big problem that doctors know about medical conditions, but they have, it seems often, have very little understanding of human nature and the human condition. So for a greater understanding of that, of human nature and the human condition, for that you have to look to those great philosophers, theologians, and others mentioned earlier. 4, finally, there's a version of my argument that would garner much wider approval and agreement, I think. If I had simply said that anxiety disorder is overdiagnosed, most people would probably agree. Say the same about ADHD and depression and other similar things, and most people agree if you say it's overdiagnosed. Even people who have been diagnosed will usually agree, though most of them will say that other people have been misdiagnosed, not themselves. So it's a very odd problem. Apparently, mental disorders are being massively misdiagnosed, but no individual person has been misdiagnosed. Quite a riddle, isn't it? Now, I think we end up here because the general problem is just undeniable. As already mentioned, there are around 300 diagnosable mental disorders and counting. 300 different ways that your mind can be considered disordered, sick, diseased. And now 50 million adults and 17 million children have been diagnosed with at least one of them. And that doesn't make any intuitive sense. How can so many people be mentally ill? At a certain point, if so many people have disordered minds, doesn't the word disordered begin to lose its meaning? To call something disordered, you have to have some idea of what the proper order is. So what is the properly ordered mind and who has it? Because pretty soon we're going to get to the point where nobody has one. And if everybody has a disorder, then it would seem like nobody does. The word just doesn't mean anything anymore. Now, this problem is apparent, I think, to a lot of people, and yet few people want to really think about why this is happening, how it has happened, how to prevent it from happening. All we're allowed to do, all that most people will allow themselves to do, is look at the problem from 30,000 feet, speak about it in very broad terms, and then ultimately shrug their shoulders and move on and do nothing about it. To get any more specific, to really dig down deep into the issue, is dangerous and upsetting, and it requires you to trample over a whole lot of sacred cows. So let's trample them. My view is that mental disorders are wildly overdiagnosed and misdiagnosed because some of the most commonly diagnosed mental disorders do not belong in that category at all. Anxiety is not the only example of this, but it's the one we're discussing today. When you take something like anxiety, which is absolutely essential to the human experience, and you declare that when it's felt to a certain degree or reaches a certain amount, it's disordered and transforms from a human emotion to a mental illness, you have opened up a floodgate that you cannot close. You could say that anxiety is only disordered when it causes problems in this or that area of your life, or is experienced for this or that reason, or in this or that way, or whatever else. But ultimately, these standards are going to always be arbitrary and subjective by definition. It's not like diagnosing a tumor or cardiovascular disease. You're attempting to diagnose the content of someone's consciousness. You are diagnosing a thought process. And yes, anxiety is a thought process. Now you might say, oh, it has physical causes, so on and so forth. It's a thought. In other words, a non-thinking being cannot be experiencing anxiety. If a person or being is not thinking anything, then it doesn't make any sense to say that they're having anxiety. Anxiety is a thought process. And that's what you're diagnosing. It's a normal thought process. One of the most normal, most fundamental thought processes. When you start slapping medical labels on normal, if painful human thoughts and emotions, eventually you'll have slapped a label on every emotion and every person. And we are well on our way to that point. The only way to stop it is to radically rethink our whole approach to mental illness. We have to start reorganizing the categories in a major way. We have to consider the possibility that not everything which causes pain is a sickness. Not every source of agony is a disorder. If we're not willing to think about that, or even to talk about it, then the tide of medicalization and pharmaceutical intervention will continue to rise until everyone is drowning in it. And for that reason today, the CIA is canceled. They weren't going to escape. I was coming back around to them, and so they're still canceled. Anxiety disorder is also canceled. Listen, hit that subscribe button right now. Do it right now. I thank you for your compliance. It is somewhat appreciated.